By this point in our investigation into the Westchew Avenue house, we've already covered the people, the property, the missing women, and some of the evidence authorities have reportedly recovered. But episode 5 takes us somewhere different. This time, we're going inside the creative archive left behind by R.C. Horsch. His books, his photography, his artwork, his private projects, and most importantly, the question investigators may now have to answer: could something R.C. created years ago have new significance today? Nothing we examine in this episode by itself proves that a crime occurred. Some of it may ultimately have an innocent explanation, but when old creative material begins overlapping with names, photographs, places, or details connected to an active investigation, those coincidences deserve a much closer look. And there is another reason we're taking such a careful look. The Philadelphia Inquirer's Dark Arts investigation examined R.C. Horsch's artistic world and the disturbing questions now surrounding portions of his archive. We are not going to simply repeat everything we've already covered about R.C.'s past. Instead, we're narrowing our focus. What did he create? Who appeared in that material? What themes repeatedly surfaced? And could investigators now be comparing those materials against what has been uncovered at Westchew Avenue? That distinction is important. We are examining possible connections, not declaring that those connections have already been proven. Imagine investigators sitting down with years, potentially decades of material: photographs, digital files, books, manuscripts, artwork, notes, old storage devices. Individually, those items may simply represent the body of work of a photographer, writer, and artist. But investigators don't necessarily examine an archive the way an ordinary reader would. They're looking for patterns, dates, names, locations, repeated faces, and details that may mean something when compared against information investigators already possess. That means something seemingly insignificant could suddenly matter. A photograph that once appeared to be just another portrait could contain information about when or where it was taken. A file name could contain a date. An original digital photograph could contain metadata. A handwritten note could mention a location. A manuscript could contain a name or detail worth checking. None of those things automatically establish wrongdoing, but together, they can give investigators leads to verify. And that's the approach we're taking throughout this episode. We're separating 3 things: what is documented, what investigators or reporting have raised questions about, and what remains theory. Because this case already contains enough extraordinary details without adding claims that haven't been established. R.C. Horsch didn't leave behind just photographs. He also published and produced a substantial collection of written material. Among the titles associated with him are Empathy, the memoir of an empathetic serial killer, Slaves, Annie, and Transgressions. There are also multiple worldview titles and several volumes published under the Amarando name. Those are the titles we are focusing on, not books attributed to him without evidence. On their own, provocative titles don't establish anything. Writers routinely explore fictional characters, disturbing subjects, philosophy, and uncomfortable ideas. The question becomes different only if investigators discover independent similarities between something in those works and something connected to the current investigation. That's why context matters so much here. For investigators, the question wouldn't simply be, is this disturbing? It would be, does it contain information that can be independently verified? Does a person appear in both the archive and the investigation? Does a location match? Does a date match? Is there a detail that would have significance beyond fiction? Those are much more important questions. This is where the line between fiction and reality can become difficult to evaluate. Authors often borrow from real life. They use places they've visited, people they've known, conversations they've heard, and experiences they've had. That is completely normal. But in an investigation, those same similarities can sometimes become relevant. Suppose investigators encounter a fictional passage containing a recognizable location. That alone proves very little. But now imagine that location also appears in photographs, computer files, or other evidence. Suddenly, investigators have something they can compare across multiple sources. And that's the key throughout this episode. We're not asking whether disturbing fiction proves real-world conduct. It doesn't. We're asking whether details within an author's larger body of work could help investigators identify people, places, dates, or relationships that can then be independently confirmed. One detail that deserves especially careful wording involves references to the destruction or breakdown of human remains. This is disturbing material, and we're not going to describe it graphically. The important question is whether references appearing in writings associated with RC have any meaningful connection to the physical evidence authorities later encountered. A fictional reference is still a fictional reference unless investigators establish otherwise. But investigators can compare terminology, methods, materials, and other details against evidence recovered during a search. If the similarities are broad, they may mean nothing. If they are unusually specific, they may warrant additional examination. And this becomes particularly noteworthy because of another part of the West Chew Avenue investigation. Chemicals were reportedly recovered from the property. That doesn't mean those chemicals were connected to anything written by RC, but it gives investigators an obvious question to examine. Is there any actual connection? Or is this simply an unsettling coincidence? Now we move away from RC's fictional world and back into the physical investigation. Authorities reportedly recovered chemicals while searching the West Chew Avenue property. The presence of chemicals alone does not tell us what they were used for. Many chemicals have completely ordinary household, maintenance, artistic, or industrial purposes. That is why laboratory identification and context are so important. What exactly was recovered? How much was there? Where was it stored? Was it ordinary for the property? And did investigators find anything else nearby that changed the significance of those materials? Until authorities provide those answers, speculation should not be presented as fact. But investigators aren't evaluating each object in isolation. They're examining the entire environment, the chemicals, digital media, documents, photographs, the writings, and whatever forensic evidence may have been recovered. The larger picture matters more than any single item. Then there is the large blue drum reportedly found in the basement. Reports have described it as approximately 100 gallons. Again, a drum itself isn't evidence of a crime. Large containers can have legitimate uses. What makes it relevant is the context in which investigators encountered it. Forensic investigators can examine a container for far more than what is immediately visible. They can document residue, they can collect samples, they can examine surfaces, they can determine what substances may have previously been stored inside, and they can compare those findings against other evidence from the property. This is also why we need to resist jumping from one disturbing detail to a conclusion. A blue drum, chemicals, dark writings. Each sounds ominous when placed together. But investigators still have to scientifically establish whether those things are actually connected. That's the difference between a compelling theory and evidence. And now we arrive at one of the biggest questions of episode 5. Could R.C. Horsch's books contain clues relevant to this investigation? Not confessions, not proof, clues. Information investigators could potentially compare against evidence they already possess. That could mean something as simple as a name, a nickname, a street, a building, a date, a description of a person, or a detail that appears insignificant until it is placed beside another piece of evidence. Investigators can then work backward and determine whether the similarity has any real significance. This is where an archive becomes potentially valuable. Instead of looking at one book, imagine indexing everything. Every manuscript, every photograph, every digital folder, every notebook, every date. Then compare those records against known timelines. Patterns that would be impossible to notice casually could suddenly become visible. But there's an important warning here. We cannot assume every disturbing passage is autobiographical. We cannot assume every woman photographed by R.C. was connected to this investigation. And we cannot assume a similarity is meaningful simply because it sounds eerie. Every possible connection needs independent evidence. R.C. was a photographer, and women appear throughout his body of work. That fact alone is neither surprising nor incriminating. The important question is identification. Who were these women? When were the photographs taken? Where were they taken? And can investigators account for the people appearing in the archive? For older photographs, identification can be difficult. People change. Files lose their original names. Dates disappear. Physical prints become separated from their negatives or original digital files. That's why investigators may need to reconstruct an archive piece by piece. A digital image may also contain information that isn't visible in the photograph itself. Depending on how a file was created, copied, or altered, metadata can sometimes reveal dates, camera information, and other technical details. Investigators would then have to determine whether that information is reliable. And ultimately, the goal isn't to make an archive look sinister, it's to identify the people inside it, because if even one unidentified woman turns out to overlap with a known missing person investigation, that could change the significance of the material dramatically. This leads to perhaps the most unsettling question raised by the archive. Could some of this material function almost like a catalog of women? We need to be extremely careful with that word. At this point, we should not state that R.C. intentionally created a catalog of missing women. That would go beyond what has been established. What investigators can do, however, is compare known women against photographs and other materials. In this case, 4 names have repeatedly become part of the public discussion: Blair Tonzelli, Maribel Fresses, Amy McHale, and Gabrielle Amarando. Their individual circumstances are different, and they should not simply be combined into one story without evidence. Each woman deserves to be examined individually. When was she last known to be safe? Who knew her? Where was she living? What connections can actually be documented? And does anything recovered from the West Chew Avenue investigation independently intersect with her timeline? Those are the questions that matter. And then we come to Blair Tonzelli. Blair's image is especially important to this episode because reporting surrounding the investigation has raised questions about her appearance within material associated with R.C. Horsch. If investigators have authenticated that connection, it gives them something concrete to examine. How did R.C. obtain her image? When did it enter his material? And what was the context? Those questions become even more important when investigators have access to original files rather than screenshots or reproductions. An original file may potentially reveal when it was created or modified. Investigators may also be able to determine where an image originated and whether copies exist elsewhere. That kind of forensic work could help establish whether the connection is meaningful. And this is exactly why Blair's image should not be treated as a spooky visual for the story. She's a real person. If her photograph genuinely appears in R.C.'s material, the priority is determining why. Was the image publicly available? Did R.C. know of Blair? Was it added before or after she disappeared? Or is there another explanation entirely? Those answers could dramatically change how significant the discovery actually is. And that is where we'll continue, because once investigators begin putting dates beside photographs, writings, and digital files, the timeline may become one of the most important pieces of this entire investigation. There is another woman whose story adds an important and deeply unsettling layer to the history surrounding R.C. Horsch, Krista Killen. Krista's name matters because, unlike many of the questions investigators are now trying to answer years later, People who knew Krista have reportedly spoken about what she experienced while she was connected to RC. Her story takes us away from books, photographs, and digital files for a moment and into the personal life surrounding RC, because Krista wasn't simply someone whose image allegedly appeared somewhere in an archive. She reportedly had a relationship with RC and spent time living with him. And according to accounts attributed to people who knew her, Krista allegedly shared disturbing concerns about what she experienced during that period. Those claims are important, but they are still claims. We have to distinguish what friends say Krista told them from facts independently established by investigators. That brings us back to the house on the 400 block of West Chew Avenue in Philadelphia. This property has become central to the investigation surrounding Eugene Horsch, but its history stretches back years. RC lived here as well, and Krista reportedly spent time here while she was with him. Imagine what this house would have been before police activity, evidence searches, and headlines changed the way the public viewed it. It was a residence. People lived here. Conversations happened here. Relationships unfolded here. And according to accounts that emerged later, Krista's experience inside this environment allegedly became increasingly troubling. What makes her story particularly significant is that her concerns reportedly weren't limited to RC. Another name enters the story, RC's son, Eugene Horsch. And according to what Krista reportedly told people close to her, she was afraid of him. That reported fear deserves careful attention. We cannot know everything Krista was thinking or feeling at the time, and we should not turn secondhand accounts into established fact. But when people who knew someone remember them expressing fear, investigators can potentially compare those statements against later evidence. Years later, Eugene Horsch would become the focus of a major investigation. He was arrested in June of 2026, and authorities accused him of offenses involving firearms and allegedly possessing fraudulent federal law enforcement credentials. Those charges do not prove the broader theories now circulating around the house, and Eugene is entitled to the presumption of innocence on unresolved allegations. But Krista's reported statements raise a haunting question. What exactly frightened her? Was it based on a specific incident, something she witnessed, something she was told, or a pattern of behavior that made her feel unsafe? According to the accounts surrounding Krista, there may have been one confrontation in particular. The basement is where Krista's story becomes especially disturbing. According to reports attributed to people familiar with her account, Krista described a confrontation involving Eugene in the basement of the house. We need to emphasize that this is a reported account, not a finding of guilt and not proof of what ultimately happened to anyone connected to this investigation. But the location is difficult to ignore. Years later, investigators would reportedly focus heavily on areas inside the same property, including the basement. Chemicals, containers, and other materials allegedly recovered from the property would eventually generate entirely new questions about what had taken place there. When an old story suddenly overlaps with the location of a modern investigation, detectives naturally want to know whether that overlap means something. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But Krista reportedly did something important after these experiences. She talked. According to accounts that have surfaced, Krista reportedly confided in friends about what she was experiencing. Those conversations matter because people sometimes reveal fears privately that never make it into an official police report. Friends may remember particular statements, changes in behavior, or concerns expressed repeatedly over time. But memories also need to be verified. Investigators would need to determine when those conversations happened, exactly what Krista said, whether anyone documented them, and whether multiple witnesses independently remember the same details. That distinction is crucial. We aren't presenting a reconstructed conversation as Krista's exact words. What matters is the broader allegation. People who knew Krista reportedly remembered her expressing fear and discussing troubling experiences connected to the house, and then the timeline takes another turn. R.C. Horsch died in 2025. With his death, any opportunity for investigators to directly question him about what he knew, what he witnessed, or what portions of his creative work may have been inspired by real experiences disappeared. And that creates a major problem. R.C. left behind writings, photographs, and other creative material, but material cannot explain itself. A disturbing passage in a book might be fiction. A photograph might have an innocent explanation. A recurring theme could simply reflect an artist's interests, or potentially something could hold investigative significance. Only corroborating evidence can tell us the difference. Krista also died before the current investigation could fully illuminate the significance, if any, of the experiences attributed to her. That means investigators cannot simply sit down with her today and ask what happened. Instead, they would have to work backward. Friends, family, messages, photographs, emails, records, dates, locations, anything capable of independently confirming or disproving parts of the story becomes important. And when investigators returned to the material connected with RC, they had something earlier generations of investigators may never have had: context. Now imagine investigators approaching RC's archive differently. Not as people casually reading provocative books or looking through unusual artwork, but as investigators searching for patterns. Names can be searched, dates can be compared, photographs can potentially be identified. Digital metadata can establish when files were created or modified. Locations in photographs may sometimes be determined, and writings can be compared against documented events. That does not mean a disturbing book becomes evidence of a real crime simply because its author lived in a house later searched by police. It means investigators can ask whether anything in that material independently matches information that was never publicly known. That is where coincidence can potentially become something much more significant. This is the comparison investigators would need to make: what appears in the writings and what actually existed in the real world. If a book contains references to chemicals, that alone proves nothing. But investigators can ask whether the specific substances, quantities, terminology, or methods described resemble materials actually recovered from the property. The more specific a similarity becomes, the more important verification becomes. The same applies to descriptions of rooms, objects, people, and events. Was something written before or after a real event? Was the information already publicly available? Could the author have learned it innocently? Or does the material contain a detail that would have been difficult to know without first-hand knowledge? Those questions are far more important than simply saying, the books are creepy. Investigators don't need creepy. They need corroboration, dates, metadata, witnesses, records, physical evidence, something independently connecting one piece of information to another. And this is where we need to separate what is documented from what remains unanswered. Eugene Horsch was arrested in 2026 and has faced criminal allegations. Authorities searched the Westchew Avenue property. Investigators have examined evidence connected with the house. Beyond those established points, many of the most disturbing questions surrounding this story remain under investigation. What happened to the missing women? Why do certain names and connections appear around the same people and property? What exactly is contained in all of the digital material investigators recovered? And does anything in RC's archive actually connect to a crime, or are we looking at disturbing creative material that has taken on a different meaning because of what investigators later discovered? Those are very different possibilities, and until forensic evidence answers them, we should resist turning theory into fact. The unanswered questions are compelling precisely because they remain unanswered. When we began this episode, we asked whether R.C. Horsch's darker creative work could contain clues. After looking at the books, the imagery, the house, the missing women, and Krista's reported experiences, the answer is not simply yes or no. The answer is that investigators now have material worth examining, but examining something is not the same as proving what it means. Similarities can be coincidence. Fiction can resemble reality. Memories can change. Every apparent connection has to survive independent verification. And perhaps that is the most important point in this entire case. We don't need to make this story darker than it already is. We need to follow the evidence. Because somewhere among the files, photographs, digital records, witness accounts, and history of that house may be answers that families have been waiting years to receive. And this investigation is far from over. In episode 6, we're going deeper into the evidence, the timeline, and the unanswered connections surrounding the West Chew Avenue house. What can investigators actually establish, and what pieces of this story are still missing? Subscribe to Halloween Night Vibes so you don't miss episode 6. Because with this case, every answer seems to uncover another question, and we're going to keep following those questions wherever the evidence leads.